In 1990, Italian investigators opened a dusty file about a forgotten weapons cache. Inside were maps, explosives, and a list of names tied to far-right militants. The trail led not to a fringe group, but to a secret army funded by Western allies. Officially, it was a defense plan. Unofficially, it was accused of terrorizing the very civilians it claimed to protect. This is the story of Gladio, and what nobody can agree on is who was really in control. Judge Felice Casson was a magistrate in northern Italy who lived on documents and inconsistencies. If he misread a file, a case collapsed. If he read it correctly, powerful people could fall with it. When a bomb killed 8 people in the town of Petejano in 1972, the crime was blamed on left-wing extremists. Casson's job, years later, was to quietly close loose S. Instead, he found a report that did not fit. The official story said the Petejano bomb was part of the Red Brigade's campaign, but forensic notes showed the explosive used was military C4, not the homemade devices typical of leftist groups. Ballistic reports had been altered. Witness statements were missing. The more Casson read, the more the Petejano file looked like a cover-up. 8 people had died in that blast. 3 Carabinieri officers were killed when they opened the booby-trapped vehicle. Their deaths were used to justify new emergency laws and mass arrests on the left. Now, Casson realized the evidence pointing to the Red Brigades had been manipulated. If the wrong people had been blamed, someone else had gotten away with murder. He ordered previously sealed archives opened. In a Ministry of Interior vault, he found references to Gladio and stay-behind units. The documents described secret caches of arms buried across Italy, run by a parallel structure outside normal military command. They mentioned coordination with the American CIA and the North Atlantic Alliance. On paper, these networks existed to fight a future Soviet occupation. In practice, no invasion had ever come. Yet the weapons were real, and some had been used. Casson traced the Petejano bomb to a neo-fascist militant named Vincenzo Vinciguerra. Arrested and confronted with the new evidence, Vinciguerra did something unexpected. He admitted planting the bomb, but he insisted he had not acted alone. He claimed he was part of a larger strategy of tension, in which attacks were carried out by the far right, then blamed on the far left, to push society toward authoritarian solutions. He said Gladio was the protective umbrella that ensured he could act and then disappear. The idea sounded like conspiracy fiction, but more documents surfaced. In 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, under pressure in Parliament, officially confirmed the existence of Gladio. He described it as a CIA and NATO backed stay-behind army created after the Second World War. Its purpose, he said, was to organize resistance if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe. Secret arms caches, training camps, and communications networks had been built in at least 12 countries. Similar revelations appeared elsewhere. In Belgium, a parliamentary inquiry examined right-wing groups and unexplained massacres in the 1980s, like the Brabant supermarket shootings, where masked gunmen killed shoppers at random. In Germany, old files pointed to Schwert and clandestine networks linked to former Nazis. In Greece, stay-behind structures were mentioned in connection with the 1967 military coup. Each country's version had different names, different commanders, but the same core idea. If communists ever took power, these hidden forces would sabotage, assassinate, and guide Western intervention. The official line from NATO and Western governments was consistent. Yes, stay-behind networks existed. Yes, they were coordinated through secret committees in Brussels and London. But they insisted these units were strictly defensive. Any involvement in terrorism, they said, was the work of rogue elements or domestic extremists, not NATO policy. The problem was that the paper trail refused to stay tidy. In Italy, declassified memos showed intelligence officers meeting with neo-fascist leaders, providing money and protection. Some of these militants later appeared in investigations of bombings, like Piazza Fontana in 1969 and the Bologna train station in 1980, where 85 people were killed. Courts convicted far-right activists for those attacks, but the higher-level sponsors remained murky, often shielded by state secrecy clauses. By the late Cold War, the pattern looked chilling. A bomb exploded. Civilians died. Initial blame fell on leftist groups. Media panic followed. Governments passed harsher security laws. Later, evidence emerged, pointing to far-right militants with links to intelligence services. Files went missing. Witnesses recanted or vanished. Official inquiries concluded that something irregular had happened, but stopped short of naming NATO as a directing hand. At the center of this web were men like William Colby, former head of the CII's Covert S in Europe, who later acknowledged that stay-behind armies were part of a broader strategy to harden Western societies against communist influence. There were also European intelligence chiefs who saw communists not just in Moscow, but in unions, student movements, and left-wing parties at home. For them, the line between foreign enemy and domestic opposition blurred. By the early 1990s, parliaments in Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland held hearings. Committees called generals, ministers, and former spies. Some described Gladio as a necessary shield in a dangerous era. Others hinted that the shield had been turned inward, used to manipulate public fear and shape politics. But many key witnesses claimed memory lapses or inked national security. Files were classified. The full chain of command, from local militants up to NATO councils, was never cleanly mapped. Gladio, as a name, became a symbol rather than a single program. It stood for the hidden architecture of the Cold War: parallel armies, black budgets, and contingency plans that sometimes bled into domestic life. Historians still argue over the extent of direct control. Were right-wing terrorists guided by Western intelligence or merely tolerated and infiltrated? Did NATO officers approve specific attacks, or did they a machine and then lose control of what it did? Felice Casson faced a choice that every investigator in this world eventually meets. Option 1. Accept the narrow mandate. Treat Pateno as an isolated crime, blame a single bomber, and leave the deeper structure untouched. That path would preserve institutional stability, aid a clash with the military and allies, and protect his career. Option 2. Follow the network wherever it led. That meant accusing parts of his own state of complicity in murder, challenging official allies like the CIA, and risking political isolation or worse. He chose to follow the network. His work helped expose Gladio to public view, forced a prime minister to confess its existence, and inspired similar investigations across Europe. But the cost was that the answers he uncovered were partial, fragmented, and often buried again under classification. The machine was too old, too distributed, and too protected to fully map. The result is a permanent uncertainty, enough evidence to know something dark existed, never enough to say exactly where legitimate defense ed and state-sponsored terror began. Today, the Cold War is over, but stay-behind logic survives in new forms. Cyber units, proxy militias, deniable contractors. Governments still tools meant for emergencies, then keep them off the books. Intelligence services still decide which extremists are threats and which are assets. The line between security and manipulation remains as blurred as ever. This account draws on parliamentary inquiries, declassified documents, and testimony from former militants and intelligence officials. The question now shifts to you. If your government told you a secret force was needed to protect democracy, but evidence suggested it sometimes killed civilians to steer politics, which would you trust? the official story, or the buried files. Type O if you would obey the official narrative, F if you would follow the files. Then look at the comments to see which side most people really choose.